Hi all, and welcome to China EVs and More, where my co-host Lei Xing and I will go over some of the week's most important news coming out of the China EV, AV, and mobility sectors. We will open the room up at around the 40-minute mark to anyone who's keen to ask us any questions. One rule, we appreciate vigorous debate, but let's all be considerate and respectful to each other. What Lei and I discussed today is based on our opinions and should not be taken as investment advice. Even if it sounds like investment advice, it isn't. We encourage those who enjoy this room to connect with us on Clubhouse, LinkedIn, follow us on Twitter, and of course, tune in again next week. My name is Tu Li, and I am the Managing Director at Jidu Auto Insights, a Beijing-based consultancy that helps organizations bring innovative and tech-focused products and services to the transportation and mobility sectors. I write a free weekly newsletter that we pull many of our discussion topics from. You can sign up for it at sinoautoinsights.com, which, of course, I encourage you all to do. Lei, can you please introduce yourself?
And good evening from my side. My name's Lei, and I am the former chief editor of China Auto Review, which published newsletters and the only tabloid magazine in English focused exclusively on the Chinese auto market. I've spent pretty much the last 20 years on the ground in China, covering the industry. I'm now in the U.S. as an independent analyst consultant, still trying to keep tabs on the rapidly evolving market. Today is episode number 17, and this week we are talking, and here are my headlines. Big shuffle in the May Chinese smart EV startup sales rankings and full-year prospects. Update on Jidu, the Baidu Geely JV. 3-child policy and potential effect on auto sales. And
so Taylor can come to China now, I guess. It is,
and Tesla China continues its funk as legal team takes actions on fuzzers, protesters, and customers. And more. Where do you want to start, Tu?
Let's start with the numbers. Let's start with May sales. What do you got for us?
The big news, I guess the big shuffle is Li Auto dropped to 4th behind NIO, XPeng, and Neta or Hozan in the May delivery numbers. And that was a big news, sort of, the early part of every month, usually during the first and the second. The leading Chinese smart EV startups announced their delivery numbers for the previous month. So that was a bit of a surprise. It's interesting that the NIO and Li Auto were the only two among the top 5 to have a month-on-month drop. And that was kind of expected because of all the talk about the chip shortage that would affect the industry in May the most. But here's the surprise, was the other 3, XPeng, Neta, and Li Motor, all had month-on-month growth. I'm looking at the numbers, and I think for XPeng, I think the big reason was they didn't have the P7 at this time last year. And this year, after the LFP models went on the market and the 3,000-kilometer NGP stunt that they did, I think, drove their sales a bit. So May was actually up over April. And the other 2, the Neta and the Li Motor, their volumes were small to begin with. And they are both in the, the 100,000 RMB, $15,000 low-end price range. So we probably don't make too much of it. But I thought it was...
But I think it should be noted because NIO and Lixiang or Li Auto still keeping up with the mass market priced smart EVs is, still pretty significant, right? NIO with 6,700 in May sales when there was 5 days of vacation. But yeah, Leap Motor, Hozan, Neta came from nowhere. To your point, they are actually priced cheaper than XPeng. They're both around the 15,000, so they're very, very, very mass market. And Leap, with their coupe, their first product was selling in the hundreds for quite some time. And I think the addition of the C11, which is more of an SUV, I think has helped them tremendously.
There's a bit of a caveat. Neta or Hozan, they have a lot of fleet sales on the ride-hailing platforms. Whereas NIO, XPeng, Li Auto are pretty much, I would say almost all of their deliveries are to private individual consumers.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a big caveat. And true, May had less sort of selling days if you take into consideration of the 5-day holiday. So seasonality wise, May is usually a slower month. March and April are kind of the highs, and May should be lower. That was expected. So I guess it was normal for NIO, but I think Li Auto was one of the reasons was the changeover from the 2021 to the 2021 one. And there's a bit of a fall off from this change that irked some existing customers. And we saw, on Twitter that, these photos posted that there were these dozens of ones being, again, there was a protest. And I believe Li Auto recently had a OTA update to have the same features on their 2020 ones.
Yep.
And I wouldn't be surprised that they come out with some sort of a compensation for the existing customers, because this is such a sensitive issue that happened when G3 announced their 2020 version. Just, only a few months after the first editions were launched. And I think Li Auto made the same mistake a bit. But on the other hand, with these fast iterative editions coming out, it's always a tough issue on how you deal with the older owners, right?
Yeah.
So I guess these...
And historically, in the automotive sector, it's mostly been physical hardware changes, right? Like mid-cycle enhancements and major redesigns. But now with software involved and hardware involved, it becomes a bit more dicey. And so these guys should have been taking notes with Tesla willy-nilly increasing pricing, and said, okay, be more like Apple and say every August or every January, we're going to come out with a new vehicle. So I think the market can kind of understand that, okay, if I buy now, then there's a chance that I'm going to miss out on the new features, blah, blah, blah. And so, I think these are part of the growing pains. Software also really creates uncertainty, because if you're trying to sell features and software upgrades as services, then what happens with the older customers? So let me make a couple comments. First of all, not every automaker is having chip shortages across the board. I think I'm calling BS on some of the automakers because they're just seeing some slight softness in demand of their vehicles. So they're hiding under the umbrella of the chip shortage. I'm not going to call out which ones I think are actually not running too much of a shortage, but there are a couple. And then part two is with this increased guidance from Li Auto about getting to 10,000 units a month starting in September, right? That also falls in line with when demand increases historically every year for auto vehicles or for car sales, because it's the end of summer. Especially this summer, it'll be interesting to see sales throughout August, between now and August, because last year, most people were in their homes not doing much because of COVID. But this year, I think in China, there's going to be a lot of domestic travel. So are we going to see even more of a drastic reduction in sales over the summer numbers, and then a huge spike starting in September throughout the rest of the year? I'm predicting that might happen, because I know, and speaking with a lot of my friends here, they're planning on doing quite a bit of traveling and having their kids go to summer camps, whereas last year there wasn't much of that going on. And so I don't know how much attention is going to be paid to buying a new car over the summer months, which historically is also not great for car sales. So I think how much of that, if Li Auto gets to 10,000 units a month starting in September or October, how much of that is the seasonality of it, and how much of it is Li Auto's cars are just amazing, remains to be seen. So
Li Auto's 10,000 units, if reached, would be much more significant than NIO because Li Auto only has one,
Right.
whereas NIO has three models. And I guess the suspense this year will be, can NIO get to 10,000 units a month and 100,000 in deliveries for the whole year? Because the year to date is close to 34,000. And if they do more than 8,000, then it's 40,000 for the first half. And expecting a higher second half, then, right, if you just do the simple math, then 100,000 units is quite possible.
Mm-hmm.
And there are also some other Xpeng. I don't think 100,000 units will be possible for Xpeng, but they probably are looking at, I don't know, 60,000 units,
Right.
70,000 units.
The P5 is going to be their big runner, which doesn't launch until the end of the year. So,
right. And the surprising thing about P5, they still haven't announced the price yet. This is very interesting. Usually, from what we heard earlier in the year, that they were going to announce the pricing after the Shanghai Auto Show. So I think probably there's a bit of a debate on pricing that vehicle with the LiDAR, right? At least maybe some variants will come with LiDAR.
Well, I tweeted this earlier this week. There's going to be a glut of 200,000 RMB or around $31,000 price point smart EVs in China. And so it's going to be cutthroat competition, which is terrific for the customer, but it's going to be really, really difficult to differentiate yourself, create discrete positioning in the market. And so I think that Xpeng is also looking and reviewing the announced entrants and when they're going to be launched and begin production. And maybe they're sharpening their pencil. Maybe they're trying to reconcile the original pricing that they had placed and maybe are going to get a bit more aggressive, So we're saying it wrong, Lei. I spoke with Eunice Yoon of CNBC. She'd asked me some questions about Xpeng, and she interviewed Brian Gu. So she was saying Xpeng like you and I. Brian is saying Xpeng. So if you watch the CNBC interview with Eunice Yoon and Brian Gu, he says Xpeng, not Xpeng. So I think we're saying it wrong. I don't know why it's Xpeng.
Well, I would just say it because the way the Chinese Xiaopeng sounds.
Mm-hmm.
So I would just say Xpeng, but I mean, that's a minor issue for what we're talking about today. But, so the P5, I don't know how many days they got like 10,000 orders. And then there's this race to get, who's going to be the first one to actually launch and deliver smart EV model with LiDAR, right? I think there's a race going on there. And then I think this is a good segue since you mentioned that 200,000 RMB price point. In about 2 years, we will see that Jidu vehicle, and they've made it very clear that it's not going to be priced below 200,000 RMB. It's going to be priced above 200,000 RMB. And so I think this is a good way to talk a little bit about what they're doing. It's still very early. I mean, the company has been only founded, since early March. So 100 days, roughly.
Right.
And they organized a media event to kind of update what they have been doing, right? So the 200,000 price point was one, and they gave out a schedule. So in October, they will be doing an official brand event.
Mm-hmm.
And then the 2022 Beijing Auto Show, they will unveil the concept. And then at the end of next year, they'll start taking orders. And then probably the first half of 2023, they'll actually have this car. So it's not that far away, considering how time flies these days.
and that means this aggressive timing means that there's no fat in that timeline, in that schedule. So if there are any major delays, it looks like they've started foundationally with a lot of Geely input, which I think puts them probably 6-8 months ahead of schedule and allows them to hit that 2023 date potentially, right? But aggressive timing also saves you on costs, right? And they mentioned that they're going to be investing $7.7 billion over the next 5 years. Pretty big number. And that the car is going to look like a robot, but it will pull on your emotions, which is kind of a dichotomy to me, because when we think of robots, we usually think of cold, unemotional. So for them to thread that needle, it'll be interesting to see how they articulate that via design and user experience.
Yeah, I think what will really be interesting about this car is I think it will be a robo-taxi without the taxi, which means it's a robo-taxi not for sharing, not for sharing, but it's a robo-taxi that you can buy and own. And if we think about the debate over the years in the industry is that with the different levels of autonomy, that L4 and 5 are usually for fleets, and anything below are for private consumers. So I think what they're trying to make this car to be is a L4 capable car that you can buy for, whatever price range above 200,000 RMB. And I think now we look at it, they have the SEA platform, right, already in place from Geely and Baidu's own Apollo autonomous driving platform. So they want to put these two together. I don't know whether that's helping them speed up things a bit, but it'll be really interesting because I think this is something between a robotaxi and a privately owned L2 or L3 capable car. And I don't think at least no one that I can think of are in that space.
Yeah, the other thing that's very interesting that would indicate decision making or who ultimately is the decision maker is that it's a 55-45 split on the ownership. So it's 55 Baidu, 45 Geely. And so Baidu is going to invest their own money into the Jidu Auto and then bring in some outside investors. So it seems like ultimately Baidu is going to have a lot of the final decision making on design, on features, and Geely may take a back seat. But, are they going to be willing to do that? Because essentially this effectively makes them a contract manufacturer. So can the team cherry pick Baidu's strengths and Geely's strengths to create and Frankenstein together a unified vehicle, to your point, that's part robotaxi, part emotional, high technology, compelling vehicle for the young consumers here in China?
Yeah, and I mean, they have this guy who's worked at, both a traditional OEM and also, the startup, Mobike, right, as a CEO.
Mm-hmm.
And they haven't talked about, they have the robotaxi business, right, which you're planning to check out, right, soon, hopefully.
Yes.
And there's a Baidu-led vehicle making venture that's trying to create an entirely something that's different, So it's still early, 100 days or probably, 2 years, wait another 1,000 days, maybe we'll see this car on the roads, right?
Well, yeah, I think Baidu has some credibility in the market, so I don't see them not having enough capital to get this thing on the road. Whether it'll be too late, I think it'll be close to too late because, again, at the around 200,000 RMB price point, it's going to be super crowded in the next 3 years. Now, how far above 200,000 RMB it's going to be is going to probably dictate who they directly compete with. But XPeng has clearly taken the positioning of the smartest mass market EV in the market. I don't think they're going to concede that very easily to anyone. So is 3 years going to be enough time for them to study, or Jidu to study and then incorporate their findings and their discovery into a vehicle? And will their interpretation of what they find be compelling enough to sell thousands of it? This is the fun stuff, right? Just kind of guessing why things are selling and other things aren't selling. So
yeah. So wait 2 more years, maybe, next Shanghai Auto Show.
Yeah, so
we'll look back and see what we talked about today and see what happens.
But let me ask you this, because one of the things that we also wanted to talk about was kind of thoughts for the rest of the year and the sales. So we've talked about Neo, XPeng, the surprises of Leap and Neta. But, where do you think the ID4, where do you think some of the foreign automakers EVs are going to end up? Because I'm hearing that the ID4 is struggling to sell in China. At least I'm hearing that. Maybe I shouldn't put words in your mouth. And then, cars like the Polestar 2, and of course the 800-pound gorilla, maybe we should talk about that for a minute or two.
Well, I mean, struggling in what sense, right? Because the numbers we saw from at least, was it April? Right, April. It was only 700 units roughly for one of the versions and about maybe 500 units for the other version. So ID4 Cross and the ID4X. So if you say, struggling, that means you were expecting maybe thousands, right? 3,000, 4,000 a month. Then, right, they were struggling. But it's the first full month on the market.
Sure.
Again, we can't, production-wise, considering they have much more ICE models also on their plate, facing chip shortage issues. So there's a kind of supply problem there a little bit. And I think it'll ramp up. I think it won't be long that they sell in the thousands. So we have to, treat it with a grain of salt and not, say it's a failure.
Mm-hmm.
It's low. It's definitely low, but what do you expect? I mean, Volkswagen, they sell how many millions,
that's
a year, and
that's definitely
and
where
their expectation, of a percentage share of NEVs, it'll be much higher in a few years' time. But I think this year we'll see, right? 150,000 units globally was their goal,
right?
And how much China will take up, I don't know, at least a third of it. If not, then that would be struggling.
Yeah, I think the EU and China need to take up more than 50%, 60% of that 150,000 units if they're going to get to 150,000 units. So where do you think with the license plate restriction on the Wuling Hongguang, do you think that sales are going to shrink for that?
No, I don't think so. Because Shanghai still hasn't announced anything yet. I mean, the rumors came out a month ago, and people are waiting, still waiting. There's no official announcement, but I guess the consensus, there will be some sort of restrictions on this type of vehicle. But the Hongguang Mini EV, they don't need to depend on Shanghai to sell.
Sure.
So it's only a small part of their entire sales.
And, we've seen these memes of these different variants that have been coming out, right? I think you tweeted about the 3-child policy Wuling Hongguang now. So
yeah, which is a good time to talk about this new policy. And see, what I'm saying is all you see is these brands and OEMs jump on the marketing bandwagon and just putting all these posters, we have these vehicles, 7 seats, 9 seats, whatever, right? I think this is more of a branding and marketing thing rather than something that will actually boost sales. Because going back to the 3-child policy, look at what happened when China announced first in 2013, right? If you are the only child for the husband and a wife, you can have one more kid. And then in 2016, it was the universal 2-child policy. So it's been 5 years. And back then, if you remember, there were a lot of talk about MPVs. And look what happened, right? So in the MPV segment, the only ones that are really the Buick GLA, we talked about this. There has been no competitors. Other than that, the minivan turned Hongguang on the low-end side, and everything in between, the MPV market hasn't grown that much. Everything's went to SUVs. So I'm not sure this 3-child policy would have any effect on auto sales at all, other than the current drive and demand for SUVs over cars, over sedans. Because, I mean, this is it's not just the issue of having an extra child, but the burden, right? You live in China, I live in China. The burden of having multiple kids and full-time working parents and taking care of the grandparents. I mean, these are like social issues that are just, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
That
Just
you put this policy out, but it doesn't mean that people are just going to have third child.
yeah, there's no incentive for them to do that because they look at it as a financial burden, unfortunately, a lot of times. And with, especially in the tier one cities, with how expensive real estate is, and culturally in China, the husband, in order to be a fit husband, and I'm oversimplifying this, Lei, so help me out here, but in order to be a fit husband, you have to have a house or an apartment for your wife. And if you're living in a tier one city, that's extremely, extremely difficult, almost impossible. So you're definitely going to need your parents' help financially and your grandparents' help in a lot of cases to buy something, outside of 4th or 5th Ring Road. And that's when you get into those hour-long commutes. There's a lot of pressure on that stuff. So I don't know how many Chinese couples were like, yes, when that law or when that policy change was announced. I don't know how many were like, yes, okay, we're going to get our third kid here. And I think a lot of people would love to have a third kid, but, the financial burden on and the stress associated with being able to take care of that child, especially because nowadays education's very expensive and keeping up with everyone else is, really difficult. So, I think SUVs will remain popular, but, that third child thing is, I don't know, in the short term, it's not going to have any effect on car sales. In the long term, I think it's going to the Chinese government is going to need to do more to encourage and help. They've already talked about, making childcare cheaper and giving more social benefits. So if that is the case, then I could see that becoming a trend in 10 years, but nothing within the next few years. I will say this as well. In Beijing and Shanghai, and this is me kind of just getting on my soapbox, they are number 1 and number 2 in the world for how expensive international schools are. They average between $35,000 and $50,000 US a year to send your child to a private school in Beijing or Shanghai. So it's a heavy burden. But, a $50,000 US school is a first world problem. But these are the kind of challenges that are. And so for the people that think China is still cheap, I think that needs to be kind of, that stereotype needs to be eliminated because it's not cheap to live here at all. So.
Yeah, the long-term effect is one of the reasons why they announced this policy. One is the aging population, and the other one is the fertility rate. I think it was, one of the lowest in recent memory, because they just did the census last year, right? And we saw these numbers a couple of months ago, but it wasn't, So long-term, right, aging population, fertility rate, then you have less people going to the workforce. And even with now graduates getting work, those type of social issues are in the long run will affect the future buying population for cars. So that's why, there were, what is the threshold of China's auto sales? There were wild guesses back in the days, right? The highest I've heard is 75 million units a year. My positions have always been 30 million units will be tops. Because if you do that every year, even zero growth, 3 years is going to be 100 million vehicles.
Yeah.
Right. And China is going to surpass U.S. pretty soon in number of vehicles on the roads.
There's just not enough. I mean, the cities are crowded as it is. So having 80 million unit sales is ridiculous. I mean, those numbers are years and years old.
And this goes back to the reason why Shanghai is not allowing the mini Hongguang EV in the first place, because they got to take care of, they've had this license, sort of free license plate for EVs things for months and years. But you also got to take care of the traffic and congestion problem. And they have to kind of pick, maybe they picked on Wuli Hongguang Mini EV, they have to do something. This is like, for officials managing, the cities, urban areas is such a tough thing to do.
Here's an anecdote for you about the traffic. When I worked in Shanghai, I lived in Xintiandi, and I would get to work around 7:30, 8 a.m. And this is when I worked at Ford in Lujiazui, which is right across the river. And it would take me less than 8 minutes door to door when I got into a cab and got into to Lujiazui to my building, because we would take the tunnel. And obviously, I'm at work until 5, 6, 7 p.m., sometimes 8. And if I took the subway or if I took a cab, it didn't matter. It would take an hour and a half. Within an hour and a half to get home, because traffic was so bad. The tunnels were backed up. The bridges were backed up. Subway, I had to take 2 stops, or I had to take two exits or change twice. And so, yeah, that's not getting any better. And the other thing I wanted to comment about is North Asia has a similar trend. So it's not just China. Japan and Korea have very low fertility rates. And so one thing I will mention that's very interesting is the British Chamber of Commerce launched their position paper last week. And for those folks who like to know about economics and kind of where the UK stands with the China relationship, they saw that their number of expats coming into China has reduced substantially over the last several years. And so part of the way you remain a globally competitive nation is to bring in the best talents. And if that's not happening and you're not hiring the best talents because of expats are leaving and the workforce is shrinking, then it's going to create challenges. So if you look at Japan, if you look at Korea, they also have very low foreigners living in those countries. And so Korea has been able to do it through innovation, but Japan has been struggling for 10, 15 years with deflation, with a struggling economy. So if China can't get in front of it, they're going to have a really, really challenging time in the next 15, 20 years to maintain their leadership in manufacturing and other businesses. So
yeah, and this actually creates an opportunity for these car companies. Who's going to take care of these aging population, right? What am I going to do to attract these? I mean, they're also their potential customers, people in their 60s, even 70s. I think they recently increased the age which you can have a driver's license in China. I don't remember the exact age limit, but I think it was raised. So these type of things, I mean, it's both challenges and opportunities. So
God
see who takes.
God bless anyone who wants to drive in China. It is like I've learned to compartmentalize it, because my wife used to get worried because I would get so upset while I was driving, and she was afraid that I would come home and still be upset. But I've learned to really compartmentalize it. When I get out of the car, when I park the car and get out of it, boom, serenity now. I've learned to be like, okay, it's kind of a totally separate thing. But man, it's so much better now than it was 8 years ago when you were here during the heyday of, Sanlun Chus, those even mechanical ones, not the electric ones, those mechanical ones that were all over the place. It's so much better now, but you still see occasionally on the airport expressway, you still see somebody going reverse on an exit ramp to come back onto an airport expressway, and you're like, holy cow, I don't think they know how dangerous that actually is. But yeah, it's still the Wild West in some parts of China when it comes to driving on the roads.
So maybe a bit about last topic on this Tesla and China legal team, and also this new article that came out from the Information.
Yep.
I think some of the people may have read about that, but I don't think it was anything surprising, right? Considering what we've seen so far. And I tweeted that, the registration numbers are not looking well.
Mm-hmm.
So this whole Tesla versus, I don't know, what do you call it? Tesla versus
the world,
right?
Yeah.
Tesla versus world soap opera has just gone to all sorts of directions, right? You have this protest incident that's still hanging in the balance, right? There's still no agreements 1.5 months after this happened. That's one side of the the battle, right? Sort of. And now you have this Tesla China legal team, which is interestingly, they set up these accounts on Weibo and Chinese TikTok. They haven't posted anything, but they followed sort of self-media, we-media people and sent, private messages and saying, warning. It's like a warning. So, and also I think Taylor is in the room. I was looking at your the Tesla hiring map, right? The legal
that thing is great, by the way. That thing is great.
Yeah, and so I mean, this thing's just getting more wild. I don't know where it's going to take us. Also, you see on the other hand, you see CATL, right, building this 80 gigawatt hour plant in Shanghai right next to the Gigafactory, and that's actually a positive news, which means
an endorsement.
Capacity, and demand is long term. It looks like it's still there. That CATL wants to do that, but I just don't understand what.
But
what is going on?
The thing is, they're going to get past this, right? So I'm not going to give any credit to any of the financial analysts or the auto analysts that said that Tesla's going to run into challenges, because everybody knew that, right? Competition was coming. We've been preaching that for a year, 18 months, right? Now, I will say over the last couple months, the sales numbers have decreased more than I thought they would. But could you imagine when Tesla comes out on the other end of this, how resilient they're going to be, how large their book of lessons learned is going to be, and they're going to be able to take it all over the world, okay? Because if they're able to turn this around, they're going to have competitive products in the market, right? So if they can rehab their brand and catch their service up to their actual sales, then they're going to be so tough. Because if NIO, if Li Auto, if XPeng get to these sales numbers in China, they're going to have similar challenges, because more people are going to have their vehicles and there's going to be more quality issues, software issues. Now, is it going to be highlighted and magnified via social media like it has been with Tesla? I don't know. If we look in 5 years from now, Tesla is the number one EV maker in the world by far. We're going to be able to point back to this time and say, you know what? They made a bunch of changes internally, a bunch of changes to how they deal with their customers, and it's helped them significantly, right? So I think this is going to be a story throughout the summer, and then once the Model Y ramps completely, which is probably another month or two, and I think they're going to get out of this. If I was Chinese EV company that was competing directly with them, which are all of them, I would be so aggressive with trying to take their customers. And so if we're going to see increases in sales in Li Auto and NIO, we can assume that there's probably some Tesla customers in those sales numbers, right? So I've said my piece about that.
Yeah, I'm just saying that I didn't expect this to drag this long and into all sorts of different directions. And what is their legal team doing, going after these? I mean, granted that, sure, quite a few of, the way you talked about social media in China, and this is where a lot of FUDs are spread, and also things spread quickly no matter what industry in China, period.
Yes.
Because of, right? And now you put Tesla in there, then it just blows up more. But it's a growing pain that I did not see this painful.
Well, I think it's an indication of how woefully prepared as well that they were for this type of prolonged, because it's I don't think it's the intensity, because they knew the intensity when they're in the moment, but how long it's been this intense is probably very, very surprising to them. And so, again, I'd kind of mentioned in an article or the newsletter, if they would just say sorry or 不好意思, I think it would go a long way to appeasing a lot of their critics. And, at the end of the day, there has to be a fund on their balance sheet that says, quality issues or whatever, right? It's frustrating to see.
That brings us to the end of this week's show. Lei and I thank you for tuning in. My name is Tu Lee, and you can find me on Twitter at Sino Auto Insight. That's SinoAutoInsight. You can find Lei on Twitter at LeiXing77. That's LEIXING77. If you wouldn't mind rating and or reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you grab your podcast from, we'd appreciate that as well. Even better, if you enjoy this show, please tell your friends about it. Please join us again next week as we track down all the latest news on China, EVs, and more.